I would like to see a Challenger 1 video.
Damn, the British need some more love. One mention of the Challenger 1.
Please do
Challenger 1
video on Challenger Mark 2.
Can you make a video on how underpowered the Challenger 1 Mark 2 is? Challenger vid when?
Still waiting on that Charlie video.
Next, do the Challenger.
There's a lot to correct there.
Please do Challenger.
You know how Gaijin can make the
Challenger
1
I'll
video.
subscribe when I see the
They're
Challenger
working on every other tank
except
on
the
Challenger
not
so
wait for the
Challenger 1 video.
Very
Every
underpowered
Please
wait.
video.
Will we
Give
get
me that
another
Challenger.
Yes, please review the Challenger 1.
This is why we can't have nice things, Koala.
Waiting
patiently. If your next video is not about the Challenger 1, meanwhile Challenger 1 Mark 2 is missing over 250mm. Wow, guys. Wow. Never has a video on my channel been so highly sought after or anticipated than the corrections video for the Challenger 1. This is that video. Let's just make sure the script's all... Oh boy, this is gonna rustle some jimmies. Good afternoon, you wee bastards, and welcome back to another video with your one and only master of British bias, the Scottish Koala. Well, it's finally time, all you lads and ladies. We're finishing off our corrections and suggestions series with the mightiest of all top tier flops, the British main battle tank, Challenger 1. What's that? This doesn't look like a Challenger? Nah, f it. I don't have the time to research that thing. We gotta get a video out. It's taken me a very long time to get this one ready for you, so I do hope you lads appreciate it. I've been doing a ton of research to make sure this is my most accurate video yet, and to my knowledge, everything I'm going to present to you today is all factually correct. First up, I want to thank all you lads who sent in submissions so far for the giveaway competition we're doing. They've all been amazing to see. What's that? You didn't know about the giveaways happening right now? Well, you'd better check out the card or the first link in the video description then. Oh, and make sure you check out the rest of our corrections and suggestions series if you haven't already, because this video will build on all the previous ones. I've made videos correcting armor, shell types, visual models, naming schemes, suggesting new additions, reworks, battle rating placements, but the one you lads all wanted to see me have a crack at was this tank. Would you believe me if I said that this is probably the most correctly modelled of all top tier tanks in War Thunder? So, several of my past videos in this series we've got going here. Oh guys, if you can't tell, I'm excited. You're going to enjoy this one. But several of the previous videos have had some minor issues, from my not knowing of certain mechanics in the game, to my being misinformed, along with the majority of people and sources in my own defense, to my being right but for the wrong reason, to things I just straight up didn't take the time to explain properly and ended up causing confusion. So I've done all my research with help from some great guys over on the Beehive Discord server, and I'm going to take the time to explain everything in detail here and in the next video I plan to put out soon. I don't want to make you lads wait more than a few days for this one, seeing as it's quite important to proving this video, so yeah, check back tomorrow. I'm going to put all the sources I've used in this video in the video description below, so if you want to do your own further research, go check them out there. What will the next video be on? Well, one very important thing for us to get out of the way right now is that different types of APFSTS shells act differently against different types of armor, which really makes things broad to try and work out, especially given the lack of primary sources and accurate information on the shells and armor themselves. I've stated before that these characteristics need a whole video of their own to discuss in accurate detail, and that's exactly what we're going to do. For today, we're just going to talk about the Challenger itself, the way it plays and why it's considered so bad in game, and so inaccurate when it's actually one of the best cases of complex armor modeling in the game. We'll talk about some of the misinformation out there and touch on the way shells and armor interact with each other before continuing that topic in detail next video. We'll then attempt to offer up a potential fix for this tank near the end of this video. I'm also giving you a handy content section here. This video is going to be a long one, and so I've broken it up into these sections. If you can't watch the whole thing at once, then feel free to go through it section by section. But skipping parts will likely result in confusion, so I can't recommend you do that. Let's start with how the Challenger functions currently. The Challenger 1 Mark II is one of the worst high tier tanks in this game, without a doubt, nowhere near as capable as the rest of its tier in 99% of circumstances, and probably the second worst 9.0 plus tank we have, beating out only the Chieftain Mark X which precedes it. Now, I'm not saying it's unusable or that you can't do well in it by any means. I've seen Challengers holding their own on the battlefield, and I know its firepower, once spaded, is more than capable of achieving kills. But you can't deny that it's not up to par, not performing at the same level as the other 9.7s, the Leopard 2K, AMX-40 and T-64B, let alone holding a candle to the tanks one step above it at 10.0, the T-80B, Type 90, Leopard 2A4 and M1 Abrams. Against the tanks that sit below it, at battle rating 9.3, it's a decently capable killing machine, but the sad fact is that you're never going to be able to avoid top tier matchmaking in a 9.7 tank, and the majority of your opponents are going to be T80s and Leopard 2s that can prove quite a challenge for you. What makes it worse in these opposing tanks comes down to a wide array of factors which on their own wouldn't mean so much, but together these aspects destroy the usability of this tank. I'm talking a lack of flat penetration to do with Leopard 2A4s, Type 90s and M1 Abrams, a low top speed for its tier, and abysmal acceleration, a distinct lack of traversing ability. I'm talking about the tank's ability to maneuver laterally while on the move and when stationary. Couple this with a slow turret traverse and the longest reload around bar that of the AMX-40 and MBT KPZ-70. Add to that the fact that everyone and their mother can penetrate your upper hull, optics and gun breach area. 3 of the tanks you'll commonly face have a high likelihood of penetrating your turret, 2 of them being near guaranteed from any plausible range, and any shell that lands on the same tectonic plates as you is going to shatter your lower front plate like it was made of tea bags. Which it probably is. 2-part ammunition means you're basically a bomb waiting to be... And you don't have the help of ammunition blowout to save you. Your side armor consists of more fuel than steel, which doesn't help your survivability much when you only have 2 fire extinguishers, and makes the tank literal Ebola to play stock, with even glancing shells setting you alight to burn slowly to death, despite your entire tank and crew being 100% operational. You're the only tank at your tier to have APDS as your stock shell, and if you're one of the 12 sad bastards in this game that actually grinded this piece of English bollocks out to spaded condition, then don't expect things to get all that much easier, comparative to the killing power of your contemporaries, with 8 out of 12 of them having more penetration than you do. Now disclaimer, this is against flat RHAE only and we'll touch on angled and LOS penetration later. War Thunder engagements happen at relatively close ranges and rely on split-second reaction times, knowledge of a map that is, for the most part, designed to keep balance and gameplay at the forefront of players' experience, knowledge of an enemy team, the specific vehicles that team is using being primarily unknown, and a whole host of other features that come with this being a game. The tactics employed by players in-game do not support the strategic, big-picture ideology that Challenger is built around. Mobility and reactionary ability are the most important aspects of top-tier combat, where capture points centrally located within a battlefield are the only objective for everybody to fawn over like pigeons around the local statue emporium. And support, reconnaissance and positioning are equally available to both teams out of the box. It is these exact aspects, those most central to War Thunder gameplay, particularly at top tier, that the Challenger forfeits in order to gain capability in aspects which are equally important in real life both in and out of combat, but do not play a role in our game. No matter how capable you are defensively, you have to pay attention to the map and your team's place on it. The fact is that you can't guarantee the effectiveness of your team at and around the capture points, which are the be-all and end-all of your matches 95% of the time. You don't know any more about the enemy team's movements and positions than they do about your own. It's actually easier to keep an eye out for sniping enemies than it is to watch for faster, more mobile tanks rushing around, given that everybody knows where the classic sniper spots are by this tier. And brawling tanks could be anywhere. What's worse is that you've no personal defense against close air support coming to revenge kill you, just the hope that there's some capable SPAGs or friendly fighters around. It's this that diminishes the usability of defensive tactics and strategies in game, at top tier, and defensive macro strategy is the only thing the Challenger excels at. Sooner or later, either someone's going to get salty at being killed by you and spawn a fighter bomber to come root your pudgy ass out of your hold down defensive position, or you're going to have to treat your snail of a tank out in a close quarters fight which you are not equally equipped to win. This is the polar opposite of the types of engagements in which Challenger tanks will participate in real life. You may have heard of the very famous quote from the MOD after the Canadian Army trials in 1987, or CAT 87, which says that the Challenger is a tank built for combat and not competitions. War Thunder is designed at least in part to be a fun and enjoyable experience for both teams and to provide both teams with an equal chance of winning battles. In other words, it is a balanced, note the air quotes, competition. The Challenger employs macro strategy in order to be as effective an asset in an engagement, but this doesn't make nearly as much of a difference to War Thunder as split-second tactical decisions and dynamic reactionary ability. The Challenger's more reserved defensive playstyle actually reminds me a lot of the way aircraft carriers play in Wargaming's World of Warships, and carries with it some of the same issues. To expand on a quote from the Mighty Jingles, you're playing chess, while everyone else is in a boxing match. You're the Overwatch, the reserved just-in-case asset, highly valuable in real life, but You're in a game that doesn't require that form of strategy to win, or be effective within battle. The Abrams, Leopard 2s, Type 90s, T-80Bs and other MBTs in your match are the ones that will end up deciding the overall outcome of the game by winning or losing micro-scale close quarters brawls. Going back to the World of Warships example, it's as if you're the aircraft carrier but the rest of both teams are in destroyers. The whole reason you're supposed to be there doesn't exist. A Challenger is potentially the least well-equipped vehicle at top tier to deal with flanking attacks, close quarters brawls, maneuvering fights, and capture point map control. This is what makes it a poorly performing tank within the game. The only reason the Challenger sees any success at all is due to the successes of its teammates, mainly M1 Abrams that carry it to victory, only allowing the Challenger to be useful in limited supply and rarely occurring situations, which still don't keep it safe from flankers or those few tanks that can not only penetrate its turret but do its own job better, having sometimes more effective turret armor against the types of ammunition fired at it, and more punishment to dish back out, but retaining the ability to maneuver into more advantageous or important positions more quickly, cover a map to prevent the loss of capture points, react dynamically, hastily and effectively, defend themselves at a pinch, and also retain some respectable armor protection on the lower portions of the tank. The only time the Challenger can really come into its own is in battle mode. 2 capture points, yours near your spawn, the enemy's near theirs. Defensive play can really be a pain for enemy tanks to combat in this regard, as they've no way of winning without pushing towards you, and the Challenger is quite good in a defensive role, when it has the chance to be. Thing is, you still can't hope to deal with faster flanking enemies and incoming aircraft, as well as the Leopard 2A4, AMX-40 and Type 90 being capable of penetrating you with relative ease. So even in your best case scenario, and during that one match in 1,000 where 9.7 is top tier, there's still the faster AMX-40 that can shear through even your toughest turret armor, and everything else can still whip out your gun barrel or breach or sneak in a lucky trap shot. For all those weaknesses, you don't really see any gains, given that your firepower, while decent, is nothing special. In real life, these issues which the Challenger's design philosophy create affect the tank in substantially different ways due to the way Challenger tanks are or were used in combat and the hostile MBTs they were fighting, which were a generation older in the Gulf Wars and significantly outdated. The principal combat strategy of Challenger users is primarily defensive, to have their tanks never engage or be capable of being engaged in a fair fight. This may seem obvious. In real warfare, battles are mediated to be fair for the sake of either side enjoying themselves. But in my own personal experience of researching battle tactics and strategies employed by different main battle tanks and their users, for example the M1 Abrams, tanks ideally like to be engaging targets to the front and potentially off diagonally to a single flank at medium to far ranges. They do this with overwatch from other tank squadrons, aerial reconnaissance and soldiers on the ground to support and make use of the main battle tank's strengths and cover their weaknesses. Challenger engagements, such as those in Operation Granby, are ideally done from extreme ranges, with solid cover provided by the terrain, covering the lower portion of the hull and, in best case scenario, the upper hull as well, leaving only the gun and top section of the turret to be seen and fired at by opposing forces. Challengers do not engage on the move unless forced to, and once their combat objectives are completed, their designated targets neutralized, they do not move aggressively into enemy territory to aid soldiers on the ground in close quarters engagements, the way Abrams and Leopard 2 tanks often do. The reason for this is that the Challenger is a highly specialized defensive weapon, and a powerful one at that, for its time at least. It is designed for long-range engagements against more mobile aggressors, not to assault prepared defensive enemy positions or fortifications, or provide close-quarters infantry support. To create the tank that embodies this philosophy, compromises had to be made in the armor protection of the hull, especially the lower plate, a renowned weak spot in many MBTs, but a whole other level in this one. Given the fact that hostile main battle tanks, anti-tank missiles and RPGs would not be able to hit the lower plate so long as the Challenger were being used correctly, and would also never be capable of surprising a Challenger squadron or battalion thanks to the amount of recon and support given to these tanks by forces that field them, their participation with the United States forces, etc., and the principles behind use of the tanks in combat scenarios, the vulnerability of the lower plate was not considered a major issue or exploitable weakness by the tank's designers. The principle had shown to be effective on Chieftain and did work well against Iraqi T-55s and T-62s in the Gulf Wars, as even in those situations when British tanks were being engaged by enemy fire while on the move, the vast majority of shots were coming into the turret. Every main battle tank today has compromises in their armor, with all of them having comparatively weak hulls, sides, rears, and roofs. But the designers of the Challenger decided to take that philosophy a step further, increasing the effectiveness of the armor on the turret, at least against the Soviets and the APFSDS shells at the time, and in due course further decreasing the hull's protection in order to keep power to weight ratios as high as possible. Once again, Challengers are not used in such a way that their lower plates become susceptible to enemy fire. It doesn't matter how weakly armoured a section of an enemy tank is if you, the attacker, can't actually see it to shoot at it. That's the reason why Leopard 2s and Abrams still have weaker hulls than they do turrets. The armour of the lower hull of Challenger tanks is designed to defend solely against small arms fire, RPGs and IEDs, which it is generally considered to be capable of. In the Gulf Wars, the Challenger 1 proved its capabilities with high reliability and serviceability, far superior to previous records after the relative failure of the Canadian Army trials in West Germany in 1987. During this conflict, a Challenger 1 Mark III tank scored the longest confirmed tank-on-tank kill to date, with the destruction of an Iraqi T-62 from 5 kilometers away. This shot used the, at the time, experimental L-26 Jericho depleted uranium APFSDS shell, later known as Charm 1. Given the still-standing world record, this was obviously not a standard engagement range for Challenger tanks, but it does demonstrate the type of engagements Challengers were designed to excel at. The majority of the 250 odd tank kills accredited to Challengers in the Gulf Wars were T-55s, heavily outdated tanks with significantly lesser armour and firepower that likely could not even fire accurately at their assailants given the extreme ranges of these engagements, and the comparatively poor computing systems on board to calculate the shots that would be necessary. Couple this with the hold down positions of Challenger during the majority of their engagements, and it's easy to see that nothing on the battlefield had even the faintest chance of penetrating Challenger at all, let alone taking one out of combat. This is how they're supposed to be used. This is how they're supposed to function. The Challenger's armour, as the majority of you will know, consists of the very famous composite armour known commonly as Chopin, Burlington or Dorchester. This is made up of ceramic tiles of extreme hardness coupled with some comparatively pliable materials attached to steel backing plates and encased within a steel framework. This armour is obviously immensely powerful against both kinetic energy projectiles such as APFSDS shells and chemical warheads like heat and ATGMs. The outer edge of this armour is heavily sloped with a constructional angle of around 52 degrees, which gives it a lot more effectiveness than just the raw thickness of the material itself. Or does it? See, the British tank designers working on Challenger weren't dumb. They knew they'd be fighting against Soviet tanks, and understood the physics of the shells which would be fielded against them, and so they used angled armour to great effect, as this armour gained significant effectiveness by being so heavily angled. The thing is, angled armour doesn't actually help you against the types of APFSDS shells which NATO tanks were firing during this time frame, which are known as monoblock long rod shells. The German DM-23, among others, is a good example of this type of shell, and we'll be comparing that to the Soviet 3BM-22 shell in order to assess Challenger 1's armour thickness and effectiveness. Information on the exact effectiveness of this armour is somewhat limited, and even when it is given, it's vague to the point where it's almost mute most of the time, due to the fact that you have to define what type of shell was tested when this level of effectiveness was found. And there are plenty of other factors and values that may be given upon testing that can lead us into a whole mess of misinformation out there. A lot of these misinformed sources are responsible for the large errors in the video I made on the Type 90, where even some government-mediated sources have this information wrong. Against the Soviet-style APFSDS shells fired normally, the Challenger 1's turret should achieve a relative protection level of around 520mm. This is in rolled homogeneous armour equivalency. In-game, we can see this by lining up the 3BM-22 shell against the armour in the protection analysis viewer. This shows the turret to be accurately modelled against the Soviet slug-style penetrators. Against the German Leopard 2A4's DM-23 APFSDS shell, which uses a monoblock long rod penetrator, we can see just how significantly this armour effectiveness is reduced, and it's almost penetrable by the DM-23. Why is this? Well, despite the DM-23 having on the stat card 250mm of penetration at 60 degrees, that's not the full story. See, this is just Gaijin's way of representing the penetration of the shell against a theoretical example target made up entirely of rolled homogeneous armour, and converting the angled effective thickness to represent what would be presented to an incoming round were it flattened out. This might sound overly convoluted. Actually, having just said that out loud, that is exceedingly complicated. But this is the best way Gaijin's physics engine and the way composite armor and APFSDS penetrations are modeled within it can be displayed to us in a definitive numerical value without being even more confusing. In reality, these monoblock long rod shells actually gain penetration at angles because of the way in which they penetrate armor and the shape of their tips. Golly! Tips, rods, penetrations. Time to get demonetized, boys. As we've established, Soviet APFSDS shells are comparatively quite poorly performing against angled armor because they break apart more easily after initial penetration. Fuck, no, I can't do it. Too much talking penetrating. Monoblock long rod penetrators, however, the types of shells fielded by NATO tanks, are more resistant to shattering along their own length, and instead begin to disintegrate at the tip of the rod, losing more and more of the length of the penetrator as the shell bores deeper and deeper. This also creates a unique effect against angled armor, where the innermost layer of material begins to rupture before the penetrating shell has actually reached it, meaning that the shell does not need to penetrate quite the entire depth of the armor materials before entering the inner compartment of a vehicle, hence why the Challenger's turret displays lesser values against these types of shells. The easiest way to demonstrate this is to talk about LOS penetrations, or line of sight, which is to say how much material is actually being penetrated when this shell enters the armor. Now, this is a rough guideline and not an exact equation universal across different shells, but the easiest way to calculate the LOS penetration of monoblock long rod shells is to take the value Gaijin gives us at 60 degrees point blank and double it. To do it any other way, you'd need to use the Lanz-Odermatt equation, which requires you to already know a ton of information about the shell itself, such as the weight, length, diameter, muzzle velocity, hardness factor, and many other values which can be difficult for many people to dig up. The Lanz-Odermatt equation is a highly reliable source capable of giving a very near accurate penetration rating for any monoblock long rod APFSDS shell, whether its construction is steel, tungsten carbide, or depleted uranium, and has actually been responsible for finding multiple inaccuracies within War Thunder, such as the extremely poor performance of JM33 at 60 degrees relative to what it should be, which Gaijin did on purpose for the sake of balancing the shell within the current game, and the overperformance of the M1 Abrams M774 shell and the M833 shell found in the game files. M833 should perform roughly on par with the German DM23, in turn a shell slightly underperforming, and M774 should not be capable of exceeding 400mm of flat penetration. In fact, realistically, it shouldn't get anywhere near that. I will leave a link to this calculator in the description below, so if you are able to get accurate data on any other shells you'd like to find the values of at different angles, be my guest. Note, however, that this does only work for monoblock long rods, which the Soviet Union did not start using until 1985 with the 3BM32 Vant depleted uranium shell, which I brought up in my video on the TATB. Predating Soviet shells are not built in the same way and so do not obey the same rules. Don't try and put the data for 3BM22 into this calculator and then tell me it's incorrect. It's most unfortunate for the Challenger that it has to fight against other NATO tanks in War Thunder realistic battles, because the Challenger, like the Russian tanks NATO designed their own tanks to fight, uses angled composite armor. Against the Russian shells, this does prove impenetrable, as it should, but against the Leopard 2A4, Type 90 or AMX-40, the Challenger loses every advantage it was supposed to gain. If you're confused about why the Challenger's turret shows roughly 520mm of effective protection against Soviet shells all the way across, but against the NATO shells has a variable effectiveness which jumps all the way down from 485mm to 430, look no further than this section right here. While the outermost layer of Challenger's turret armor retains a constant slope, the inner wall between the Chopin armor and the fighting compartment flattens out at the lower edge. Against Soviet shells, this does effectively nothing to the effective protection, but once again against NATO shells, it causes the Challenger to suffer greatly. This is because composite armor, of the type of array used in the Challenger at least, is designed primarily to be effective versus chemical energy threats. Against kinetic energy munitions, it can legitimately be less effective than spaced armor beyond a certain thickness, as it provides a stable channel through which the penetrating rod can pass, without offering up nearly as much resistance as steel. The chemical effectiveness of the turret armor can be given to us easily by taking into account the fact that the 9M113 Conkers, or 85 Spandrel to NATO, and the 9M114 Storm, or 86 Spiral ATGMs, were capable of penetrating the turret armor under certain conditions. Ergo, the chemical effectiveness of the composite array has to be within the general realms of the penetration rates of these warheads, roughly 600 to 650mm. This is once again reflected accurately in game. Challenger's hull armor array is interesting due to its complex shape and angle, which actually surpasses that of the turret cheeks, at least in 2 axes. It should be noted though that not only does the turret slope up, but it also slopes back from the center, while the hull only slopes upwards at 60 degrees. Once again, the MOD knew who they'd be fighting, and the upper hull actually does have a high chance of defeating rounds fired by T-55As beyond 100 meters. It is here on the hull that we find the only inaccuracy of this tank's armor. While the hull is accurately performing against chemical warheads, achieving the required 500mm minimum chemical effectiveness of the upper glacis array, the kinetic energy effectiveness of this armor plating was recorded at 275mm RHAE, or rolled homogeneous armor equivalents. This it does not achieve in game. Finally, we get a smack Gaijin upside the head for ruining this tank so badly. The easiest way to find this out is to use a full caliber projectile like an armor piercing round from a T-55A. 275mm effectiveness. Got that? Remember that. Instead, in game, it only gets 272mm. Oh wait. Misconceptions about the armor and its effectiveness generally come from people not knowing about the increased capability of NATO shells versus the angles of the armor, or using LOS penetration as the basis for which shells could or could not penetrate the Challenger's turret. For example, the French OFL 120G1 shell, a monoblock long rod APFSDS, has a penetration of 485mm at 500 meters, not enough to penetrate the top of Challenger's turret. However, the LOS penetration of this shell at 60 degrees is as high as 540mm at this range. Some sources recording the values demonstrated in ballistics tests have a nasty habit of providing only these LOS values instead of the flat RHA penetration demonstrated, and so, depending on the source used and whether or not it does this, you may be tricked into thinking that the Challenger's turret must therefore be 540mm effective, as OFL 120G1 theoretically could not have penetrated it. This is using a flat RHA model. This makes it particularly difficult to lock down the effectiveness of armor if you're using examples of shells that could or could not penetrate it, because in turn you're using the armor that could or could not be penetrated in order to work out the effectiveness of the shell. That type of circular logic just does not work, but it's responsible for many false statements that Challenger's armor should be more effective. There are also multiple sources from the MOD created back during the development phase of the Shear 2, the tank designed from the Chieftain Mark V that would eventually become the Challenger. These sources are from just after that project went cold and the idea for the British Army to adopt the new main battle tank was picked up, and are in effect suggestions for future upgrades to the current platform to increase protection. However, many of them did not end up being assumed by the Challenger 1 but instead the Challenger 2, another tank not quite as well armoured as people may think, with the JM33 shell we already have in game being capable of penetrating Challenger 2's turret point blank. Another thing to take into account is that the effectiveness of the Chop'em array in general is known, and given the weight and thickness of the material itself, the maximum potential effectiveness can be calculated quite simply. And guess what? It comes out to about 525mm RHAE. That's right lads, despite popular opinion, the armour of the Challenger 1 in-game is legitimately correct. Gaijin's got it right. Just the armour though. Actually, the shells are accurate too. The misinformation as to their supposed higher penetration rates comes once again from people hearing the values of these shells' LOS penetrations at 60 degrees. For example, I commonly hear it said, and have fallen for this in the past, that L23A1 should have around 460mm of penetration rather than the 415mm it has in game. This is true for LOS, but this is actually reflected in game. Once again, looking at the value given for point blank penetration of RHA at 60 degrees, we get 230mm. Doubling that as we have before, yep, 460. Without going into this sort of detail all over again, the other shells are also accurate. Using this same equation actually gives us this information. Actually, in raw penetrating value numerically, the shells are slightly overperforming. However, this raw penetration value in-game is tied to the way Gaijin models armor, which is flawed, and technically all composite armor in-game is functioning slightly incorrectly by Gaijin's own design. This is just down to the fact that this is a game running off of a man-made physics engine, and things have to be coded to work with each other. In raw values and statistics, the shells may look to be overperforming a bit, but in practice, actually going up against a real target, they do perform as they should. Besides Hesh. Hesh is shit. But don't worry lads, just because the current Challenger is performing accurately doesn't mean we can't help solve its multiple issues. So to all my fellow British tankers out there, those of you brave enough to use Challengers, let me just assure you that all hope is not lost. This tank is one that most definitely deserves to be respected, especially given its pedigree and combat performance in real life. It breaks my heart to see just how screwed over this tank is by the gameplay and meta within this game, but we may be able to help fix that and give this tank the respect it deserves. The Challenger we have in-game is the Mark II variant of the Challenger 1, known in-game simply as Challenger Mark II. This is not to be confused with the actual Challenger 2 main battle tank developed in the mid to late 90s and still serving to this day with the British Armed Forces. The reason our in-game tank is not known as the Challenger 1 Mark II specifically is because in real life, the tank was only given the designation of Challenger 1 after the Challenger 2 was developed, and there was no need to distinguish it as Challenger 1 before this time. For the same reason, the Leopard A1A1 in the game is not known as the Leopard 1A1A1, which it was known as in real life beyond 1979 when the Leopard 2 was first produced, and the distinction became necessary. Funnily enough, this means that the prototype Leopard A1A1 with the L44 should be named Leopard 1A1A1 L44, as it's the 1985 variation of this prototype, or it could be named Leopard 1A5 L44, but we're not getting into that again. This might seem like obvious information to many of you, but I have had some comments questioning why our tank, the Challenger 1, is called Challenger 2 by Gaijin when it is clearly not this tank. What makes it even worse is that the Challenger variants, the Mark 1, 2, 3 and 4, are often written down like this, with the Roman numerals designating the Mark and all of these being Challenger 1 tanks. Of course, known simply as Challenger tanks up until the existence of the Challenger 2. We all clear? Bro. Oh, and Challengers can also be referred to by just the abbreviation CR, with CR1 meaning Challenger 1 and the CR2 designating the Challenger 2, just to make it nice and challenging for us. Slipped it in there again, didn't I? The Challenger Mark I was the initial variant of the FV4030 main battle tank developed from the collapsed Shear 2 project and did not feature the Thermal Observation and Gunnery Sight or TOGS. This variant did retain the majority of other features of the later variants of the Challenger besides shells. It would not feature the L23A1 shell as seen as a Tier 4 upgrade module on our in-game tank. With this in mind, I think that this tank, which would retain the speed and armor of the Challenger Mark II but miss out the upgraded shell, would make for a good 9.3, while I believe the Chieftain Mark X could be lowered to 9.0 alongside a T62M1, which beats it out in almost every conceivable way. I also think that the Chieftain Mark V should be lowered to 8.3 in its bracket with the Mark III. If all T54s can exist at the same battle rating, then so can the Chieftains Mark III and V, as there's almost no difference between them, besides 7 kph top speed. Big deal. This would also make way for the Chieftain 900 to be Britain's 9.0 premium, alongside the American XM1, German Leopard L44 prototype, I still say this should have been the 105mm equipped Leopard 2AV, and the Soviet T55AM1, which sits a step lower at 8.7. Previously, I'd said that this tank might be too good to sit at 9.0, as it should outperform the Chieftain Mark X by just a little bit, but with the Mark X being lowered to 9.0, the 900 could sit there too. The MBT-80 may also make for a good British premium, although once again that might prove just about 9.3 worthy alongside the MBT-70. For a full discussion on this, see my 9.0 premiums video. With the Mark I sitting at 9.3 competing with the MBT-70 and T64A, the Mark II could be swapped out for the more widely used Challenger Mark III. The visual differences would be nothing. The differences at all between these two tanks are negligible, the main differences being to internals, which wouldn't matter in game, but the new shell is what we're after. But Koala, what about the add-on armor? Well, I'm glad you asked. The Challenger tank used in Operation Granby with a Mark III variety, with the Mark IIs only being used for the Canadian Army trials in West Germany in 1987, rather than seeing actual combat. The Challenger Mark III, or Challenger 1 Mark III, was fitted with add-on explosive reactive armor to protect from RPG or ATGM fire to the lower frontal plate, and some add-on armor plating along the sides of the tank, reminiscent of the FV510 Warrior. Interestingly though, there is no reason the Mark II variant of the Challenger could not see this armor, and it was fitted to some Mark II Challengers used by the 4th Mechanized Brigade in November of 1990. These tanks also had armoured storage bins for the 120mm ammunition. The differences provided by this external add-on armor would be useful against BMP-2s, would give the tank some added protection against helicopters, and would likely be capable of deflecting the armor-piercing belt of top-tier SPAA.
The added protection may also be enough to defend against shells from lower tier tanks at long ranges, such as the T-55AM or Object 906, tanks seen frequently even at top tier. Aside from the add-on armor, the Mark III would also be able to make use of the L-26 Jericho depleted uranium APFSDS shell I mentioned earlier. This shell, using the Land's automatic equation, should achieve between 470 and 480mm of flat penetration at point blank range, and a whopping 520mm LOS penetration at 60 degrees, or 260mm as would be shown on War Thunder's stat card. There would be no other differences between the Mark II and Mark III that would show in game, meaning there'd be no point giving us both variants, but the Mark I at 9.3 could prove worthwhile, especially in simulator mode. The Challenger Mark III could see the add-on armors and modifications similar to many other tanks in game with this type of equipment, and would sit potentially at 10.0, or given its lack of speed, it could remain at 9.7 without being game-breakingly overpowered. Once again, it still doesn't have the penetration to rival the AMX-40. It would likely fire either L23 or L23A1 stock and see the L26 shell, or BD-26 as it was known during the Gulf Wars, as its upgraded shell. BD-26 is the experimental designation for the L26 shell, with Jericho being the code name for it in Operation Granby. It only became known as Charm 1 when fired by the Challenger 2s with their L30 120mm rifled gun. People have pointed out that during Operation Granby, Challengers carried very limited numbers of these experimental shells, being commanded not to waste them on T-55s, and instead to save them for potential engagements against T-72Ms fielded by the Iraqi Republican Guards. This situation never ended up happening, but the shells were used. However, this self-imposed restriction was nothing to do with an inability to carry more of this type of shell, and would not necessarily need to be reflected in game. Any amount of BD-26 Jericho shells could be carried in game, and the high penetration along with the extra protection would give the tank a bit of an easier time within the current game. Unfortunately, this addition would still not save the Challenger completely, and I think we as British tankers just have to accept that this is a battle we're never going to win. The way this game functions, the way it's designed intrinsically, does not lend itself to the type of gameplay we'd need in order to be effective in Challenger tanks. The same will be said, I'm sure, when the Challenger 2 eventually comes into our game. The doctrine of these vehicles just doesn't work with the style of this game, and there's very little that can be done about it. Perhaps redesigning maps with more potential positions where a hold-down Challenger could prove more effective in guarding key locations, or adding new game modes with mechanics designed to promote the macro strategy ideologies that Challengers need to use. We should remove the kill cam so as not to give away the position of a defensive Challenger which just invites revenge bombing close air support, and potentially model in some type of realistic optics that would allow these tanks to very easily range find for helicopters, as currently the in-game rangefinder only works for terrain. I'd love for you guys to leave your thoughts in the comments, as I'm sure there are many other ideas out there, but that's going to conclude our very long-winded discussion on this tank. Oh boy, it feels weird to reach the end of this. Currently my script is over 10 pages long, and as I'm recording this, it's been going for around almost 50 minutes. But you lads asked for it, and I do sincerely hope you've enjoyed this video, as a ton of work went into it. I apologise for the gap between videos, but I do feel it was worth it for this one. If you did enjoy this video and did appreciate the work hours spent on it, then I'd hugely appreciate your support over on my Patreon page, the link to which can be found in the video description, as without your guys' ongoing support, this just wouldn't be possible. Once again, a lot of work hours went into the creation of this type of content, and it's difficult to spare that amount of time when you don't really get paid for it. So, to those of you who do support me, thank you. It means a ton. If you did enjoy, please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, as we're almost at my goal of 10,000 subscribers, which I want to hit before the end of this year. Leave all your thoughts to everything I've said in this video in the comment section below, and be sure to leave timestamps to anything I've said which you want to discuss, as it really does help me clarify. If you'd like to discuss things further, you're also more than welcome to come and join my Discord server, link in the description below, as I'm always up for a chat there. It's honestly the best place to reach me. If you do want to present any evidence of information correcting anything which I've said here, do feel free. I believe everything is correct in this video, but there is always the chance I've mucked up something somewhere. If any corrections do need to be made, I will pin them in a comment, so do check there before posting. Once again, all sources are referenced and or linked in the description, so do feel free to do any fact checking you feel is necessary. Sometime soon, I'll have a video out talking about the APFSDS shells and their penetration characteristics, different angles and penetration values, and all that other good sciencey stuff. But that video may end up taking a little while again, as there's no way I'm willing to let any mistakes find their way into that one. So I thank you lads for bearing with me if it does end up taking a while, as I thank you for bearing with me with this one. Having finished the corrections and suggestions series now, however, we're finally ready to talk future tanks. That's right, the M1A2 Abrams, Leopard 2A5, Challenger 2, T90 Vladimir. We'll discuss them all in a video soon to come, which I am very, very excited for. They'll all be coming to War Thunder. You just wait. Anyway lads, I'm going to stop rambling now and just end the damned video. Once again, please like and subscribe and comment below. Come follow me at all of the social media links in the video description. Come join this giveaway before it ends in a couple of days. And always remember lads to keep your bagpipes to hand, your kilt firmly on, and I shall see you in the next video.